The school hallways were nearly empty, the last echoes of hurried footsteps fading into silence. The sun had long started its descent, casting golden streaks through the high windows of the classroom. Most teachers had already left, their day ending when the final bell rang, but not Mrs. Taylor. She sat at her desk, flipping through a stack of papers, her glasses sliding down her nose. She wasn't one to leave when there was still work to be done. And today, there was one student in particular who needed her help, Daniel, a quiet and reserved boy from her 10th grade English class, sat across from her, his head bent over his notebook. He wasn't failing, but he was struggling, and Mrs. Taylor could see it. Not just in his grades, but in the way he hesitated before speaking, the way he looked at his assignments like they were impossible mountains to climb. "You're actually really close," she said gently, tapping her pen against the paper. "You've got the right idea here, but your sentences need a little more clarity." Daniel nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. He never asked for help in class. In fact, he barely spoke unless he had to. Mrs. Taylor had seen students like him before. Kids who tried to blend into the background, who carried something heavy on their shoulders, but never let anyone close enough to see what it was. The classroom was quiet except for the scratching of Daniel's pencil. Mrs. Taylor stole a glance at the clock. It was late, much later than she had planned to stay. But when Daniel finally looked up, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like relief. She knew she had made the right choice. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I get it now." Mrs. Taylor smiled. "Anytime. We'll go over it again tomorrow if you need." Daniel hesitated, then gave a small nod before gathering his things. As he stood, she noticed how tired he looked. More than just from schoolwork. It was a kind of exhaustion she recognized, one that didn't come from missing sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. "Do you have a ride home?" she asked, watching as he slung his worn-out backpack over his shoulder. "Yeah," he said quickly. "My dad's outside." Something about the way he said it, hurried, almost dismissive, made her pause. But she didn't press. Instead, she watched as he walked to the door, hesitated for just a second, then disappeared into the dimly lit hallway. Mrs. Taylor sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She'd had many students over the years, but something about Daniel stayed with her. Maybe it was the way he never quite met her eyes. Or maybe it was the quiet gratitude in his voice, like he wasn't used to someone staying after to help him. The next day, Daniel was in class like normal, though he seemed different, less withdrawn, more focused. He even raised his hand once, something she couldn't remember him doing before. It was small, but Mrs. Taylor noticed. And then, just as quickly as things seemed to be improving, he stopped showing up. Days passed, then a week. The empty seat in her classroom stood out like a missing puzzle piece. She asked the front office, but there was no explanation. No phone call from his parents. Nothing. Something wasn't right. Mrs. Taylor had seen students disappear before. Some moved, some transferred. Some just stopped coming altogether. But this felt different. She couldn't explain why, but she knew in her gut that Daniel needed someone to notice, someone to care. She just didn't know that caring would lead to something she never could have imagined. Mrs. Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time she walked past Daniel's empty seat, an uneasy weight settled in her chest. She told herself that maybe he was sick, or maybe his family had moved suddenly, without notifying the school. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. After another week of silence, she decided to take action. She searched through the school records, finding an emergency contact number for Daniel's father. With a steadying breath, she dialed. The line rang a few times before a gruff voice answered. "Hello? Hi, is this Mr. Carter? This is Mrs. Taylor, Daniel's English teacher." There was a long pause. Then, "Daniel's not in school?" "No, he hasn't been for over a week. I was hoping everything was okay." Another pause. This one felt heavier. Finally he muttered, "Yeah, we've been dealing with some things." The way he said it made her skin prickle. He didn't elaborate, and when she gently pressed for more information, he gave short, clipped answers before ending the call. Mrs. Taylor sat there for a moment, staring at her phone. Something about his tone bothered her. There was no concern in his voice, no frustration about his son missing school, just a cold, distant response that left her with more questions than answers. That evening, she found herself looking up Daniel's address. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing, but she couldn't let it go. The next afternoon, after school, she drove across town to where Daniel lived. His neighborhood was nothing like the ones most of her students came from. The houses were smaller, worn down, with chipped paint and overgrown yards. It wasn't a bad area, but it had the kind of tired look that told a story of struggle. When she pulled up in front of Daniel's house, she hesitated. The curtains were drawn, and the place seemed eerily still. For a moment, she considered turning back. Maybe she was overstepping. Maybe Daniel was fine, and she was just imagining things. But then the front door creaked open slightly, and standing there, peeking out, was Daniel. His eyes widened when he saw her. He looked thinner, paler, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He opened the door a little more, glancing behind him nervously. "Mrs. Taylor." His voice was hushed, almost as if he was afraid to be heard. "Daniel," she said softly, "I was worried about you. You haven't been in school." He glanced back inside, before stepping out and pulling the door shut behind him. He was fidgeting, his fingers picking at the sleeves of his worn-out hoodie. I'm fine," he said, but the way he said it made it clear that wasn't true. Mrs. Taylor lowered her voice. "Is everything okay at home?" Daniel looked down at the ground, shuffling his feet. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then the door behind him swung open abruptly. A tall man stood in the doorway. Daniel's father. His face was hard, unreadable, but his eyes were sharp as they landed on Mrs. Taylor. "What's going on here?" His voice was even, but there was an edge to it. Mrs. Taylor forced a polite smile. "I'm Daniel's teacher. I was just checking in since he's been out of school." Mr. Carter's expression didn't change. He looked at Daniel, then back at her. "He's been sick," he said flatly. "We'll send a note when he goes back." Daniel stood stiffly beside him, his shoulders tense. He didn't say a word. Taylor could tell she wasn't welcome. She nodded slowly. "I understand. I just wanted to make sure he was okay." Mr. Carter didn't respond. He just gave a slight nod and stepped back, pulling Daniel inside with him before closing the door. Mrs. Taylor stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. That interaction had confirmed what she already suspected. Something was very wrong. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the look on Daniel's face, the way he barely spoke, the fear in his eyes. She knew she couldn't just drop it. The next day, she met with the school counselor and explained everything, though they agreed it was concerning, without any clear evidence of wrongdoing. There wasn't much they could do right away. Days passed. Then one evening, as Mrs. Taylor sat grading papers, she heard a knock at her door. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Confused, she set her papers aside and went to answer it. When she opened the door, she gasped. Daniel stood there, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face pale and eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go." Mrs. Taylor's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about missing school anymore. Something was seriously, terribly wrong. Mrs. Taylor's heart pounded as she stepped aside, letting Daniel into her house. His hands were shaking, his backpack clutched tightly against his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. She could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that didn't just come from being lost or confused. This was deeper. She gently closed the door behind him. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked, keeping her voice calm, even though every instinct told her something was very, very wrong. He swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. I had to leave," he whispered. "I couldn't stay there anymore." Mrs. Taylor's stomach twisted. She had suspected something was wrong at home, but now there was no doubt. She led him to the couch, handing him a glass of water. "You're safe here," she said softly, "but I need to understand what's going on." Daniel hesitated, gripping the glass tightly. Then, finally, he spoke. "My dad. He doesn't really care about me," he admitted. "Ever since my mom passed away, he just shut down. He barely talks to me. He doesn't check if I eat, doesn't care if I go to school. Some nights, he doesn't even come home." His voice wavered, and he wiped at his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed. "I tried to manage on my own, but it got worse. He started getting angry all the time. I never knew what mood he'd be in when he was there." Mrs. Taylor felt a lump rise in her throat. No child should have to live like this. "Daniel," she said gently, "have you told anyone about this before?" He shook his head. "I didn't think anyone would care." The words broke her heart. She reached over, placing a hand on his. "I care, and I promise you, you don't have to go through this alone." She knew what had to be done. This was beyond just checking in. Daniel needed real help. She assured him he could stay with her for the night, and first thing in the morning, she would call the right people. He was hesitant at first, but exhaustion won out. That night, he slept peacefully for what seemed like the first time in a long while. The next day, Mrs. Taylor contacted the authorities and the school counselor, explaining everything. It wasn't an easy process. Nothing like this ever was. But with her support, Daniel was placed in the care of extended family, an aunt who had been trying to reach out to him for months, but hadn't been allowed to. Weeks passed, and for the first time, Daniel started to look like a kid again. He came back to school, more present, more engaged. His grades improved, but more importantly, so did his spirit. He smiled more. He even made friends. And then, just before the school year ended, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as Mrs. Taylor was packing up her classroom, Daniel walked in. But this time, he wasn't alone. His aunt stood beside him, a warm smile on her face. And in Daniel's hands was a small, carefully wrapped box. "We wanted to say thank you," his aunt said, "for everything." Mrs. Taylor looked at Daniel, who, for the first time, held his head high. "You didn't have to," she said softly. Daniel grinned. "I wanted to." She opened the box, and inside was a simple silver bracelet, engraved with the words, "You made a difference." Tears welled in her eyes. She had never done any of this for recognition, but in that moment, she realized something. Small acts of kindness could change a life. Daniel had a future now, a real one, and for Mrs. Taylor, that was the greatest gift of all.